All right, turn over to 1 Kings chapter 20, where we are continuing our study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha. Though, of course, as we've talked about, Elijah and Elisha are not actually in this chapter specifically, but it is the times in which they live, and it's kind of important to go over this stuff, even when they themselves are not mentioned, to give us context for what is going on and why they're doing the work they're doing. So we have been in chapter 20 for a little bit, and this is a military conflict we have between the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, and Ahab, king of Israel. Just a kind of quick review as to what we've gone over so far in this chapter. Ben-Hadad gets a conglomeration of, I think, a bunch of lesser kings. It seems to be the implication of 32 other kings, and he invades Israel. And he gets so far as to Samaria, the capital of Israel, which is, again, not a border city. He had to go quite a ways south to get there, which seems to kind of imply that Israel was not ready at all for this. There seems to be no indication of any other battles or resistance as the Aramean army marches down to Samaria. And he gets there and basically tells Ahab, turn over your riches, your wives, your children. And Ahab is happy to do so as long as, he's going to leave him alone. And then he comes back with another message saying, well, actually, we're going to send our officials in, and they're going to take everything they find of any sort of value. And again, for whatever reason, this is where Ahab draws the line. This would be an extreme humiliation beyond what was already required of him. And after some consultation with some Israelite elders, his answer is no, but not in such a nice way. And there's a little bit of back and forth between the messengers, and Ben-Hadad eventually says, I'm going to destroy this city, and Ahab says, try me, kind of thing. They have some very interesting fighting words, and Ben-Hadad gets ready to attack the city, and of course during this time, he and the other kings are in their tents getting drunk, having some kind of feasting fun at some point. And a prophet of God comes to King Ahab, and we've talked about this is probably not Elijah. There are other prophets that are mentioned, although they're not given their name. But there are a lot of other prophets doing the same kind of work that Elijah is during this time. But it's not Elijah. We don't see any indication of that. I've talked about that quite a bit. I won't go too much into it again. But basically, the prophet gives Ahab instructions on what to do. He says to send out the young men in front, or the young officers, junior officers, depending on translation. And according to the numbers we have, he had 7,232 men to fight an Aramean army that was probably over 100,000, well over 100,000, which we'll talk more about that number again later. I haven't quite gotten to that part yet. But they are successful. They rout the Arameans. Of course, Ben-Hadad and his officials being drunk probably did not help. But basically, they destroy the Aramean army to a very high degree. And Ben-Hadad retreats, and they kind of do a little debriefing. What can we do differently to make this battle go our way this time when we attack next spring? In fact, the prophet of the Lord tells Ahab, next spring Ben-Hadad is coming back, so be ready. And Ben-Hadad, of course, is planning to attack, and he and his officials talk about all the things that they're going to do, and this is a number of things. One of the things is, seek different territory to fight on. Instead of the hills of Samaria, let's find some plains that we can fight on, because their gods are gods of hills, and if we fight them in the plains, they won't have that advantage, which, again, I don't know exactly where they've got that information. That's never been declared anywhere else in this scripture that they had this idea. The only thing that really would make sense is their chariots and horsemen would be more effective in plains rather than hill country. So there would be an advantage there, just not for the reason they give. It seems kind of interesting that this is this is what they're suggesting for this reason. They also talk about replacing the 32 kings with other officers. Probably those 32 kings did not do very well in the previous battle. Not necessarily because they were incompetent, but they were drunk. Again, they were with Ben-Hadad getting drunk, it seems, for a decent amount of time. But we're not told exactly how long they were spending drinking, but when they got routed the first time, it was noon, and they were still drinking. So I have to say that they were probably I think in the modern vernacular we would say they were wasted. They were not in any sort of capacity to fight back. And then they also tell Ben-Hadad, okay, let's rebuild this great army, horse for horse, chariot for chariot. It's going to be exactly as grand as it was before. So this is Ben-Hadad's plan, and they're going to basically get ready for the upcoming fight, and he does everything they suggest. And that's as far as we got, I think, last week. So that puts us starting at verse 26. Are there any comments, anything we need to mention before we move on to new territory here? I know that was a bit of a review, but there's been a lot going on.
This expression that the Israelites killed each man for man, that each one of them killed an enemy, and that was the losses. And that loss started the flight of the Syrian army, so that they lost, about 7,000 to 7,500 people. That would have been their losses. So that's what they replaced.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, see, the Israelites were not on horseback. So they're not going to, if they pursue the enemy, they're running foot for foot. They're not probably going to catch that many of them. So it's not likely it would be a rout of all 100 and something thousand people.
Yeah, and you're referring, I think, there to verse 20. But if you go to verse 21, it says, the king of Israel advanced and overpowered the horses and chariots and inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. So I'm going to assume it's more than that. It may be perhaps at the first strike, each one of them struck down someone, but I think there was some pursuit, because not every Aramean had a horse or a chariot to go by. So there were probably a lot of them that were also on foot as well. So it was probably more than that. We're just not given a number exactly.
This expression at close of verse 21, there was a great slaughter, suggests that it's more than just the 7.
That would be my assumption. I would expect at least in the tens of thousands. That at minimum. Again, we're not given an exact number. It may be that they were just fighting out there and they lost count of how many they killed, sort of thing. We're not told. But it is still significant that footmen are defeating chariots and horsemen, which in those times, if you had a chariot, you should have a major advantage, or if you're on horseback, you should have a major advantage. Aside from just speed and being able to retreat quicker, you've got, in essence, a whole other piece of equipment that another man doesn't have. And Israel, this is kind of an aside, but Israel never really ever has a significant contingent of horsemen or chariots. Now, there will be times where I think Solomon had a certain number that were counted up, maybe a few other kings. I can't remember off the top of my head. But Israel is primarily light infantry. When we look at kind of their military history, that's their primary focus on soldiers, not always well armed. If you remember back to the reign of Saul, early on in his kingship, it talks about how no one had a sword except for Saul and Jonathan, his son. No one else had a sword, which doesn't mean they were necessarily just fighting with clubs. They might have had spears, but nothing as dominant as the sword. So Israel has always been kind of this lower, inferior military might as far as technology. So the fact that they're able to inflict heavy losses on horsemen and chariots is a big deal in itself. Yeah. Any other comments or anything?
Remember this statement that David said that God saves not with the spear or the sword, but the battle is the Lord's. So that's one of the reasons why God never developed a big military complex, industrial complex, amongst the Israelites. They were not going to be an empire.
Yeah, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will trust in the name of the Lord our God. Yeah, it's and that comes up over and over. Continually, Israel should be in a position where it doesn't win, but does. And of course, that is God interceding. And this is God interceding here in this battle and in the one we're about to go into also. And God makes it very clear. In fact, one of the reasons that the prophet, when he comes to Ahab, the primary reason that Ahab is getting this victory is not because Ahab is a good man. He's a terrible king. We've gone over that a little bit already. He's doing it to show that God is the Lord. You're going to know that God is giving you this victory, not because you are going to get the victory. You're way outnumbered. If we have consistency between the numbers in the first and second battle, there's absolutely no way that the Israelites should win either one of them. But God is delivering them to prove that he is the Lord and he is in charge of what's happening here. So we're going to get more of that in the second battle here. Any other comments before we get into that second battle? Okay. Well, let me get someone to read for us because I've been talking a lot. Someone read for us 1 Kings chapter 20, verses 26 through 30, please. 26 through 30.
So it was in the spring of the year that Hadad mustered the Syrians and went up to Alhag to fight against Israel. And the children of Israel were mustered and given provisions, and they went against them. Now the children of Israel encamped before them like two little flocks of goats, while the Syrians filled the countryside. Then a man of God came and spoke to the king of Israel and said, Thus says the Lord, because the Syrians have said, The Lord is God of the hills, but he is not God of the valleys. Therefore I will deliver all this great multitude into your hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And they encamped opposite each other for 7 days. So it was that on the seventh day the battle was joined, and the children of Israel killed 100,000 foot soldiers of the Syrians in one day. What verse did you say?
Through 30.
But the rest fled to Alhag into the city. Then a wall fell on 27,000 of the men who were left. And Ben Hadad fled and went into the city into an inner chamber.
Okay. So, lo and behold, the next spring, as the prophet had told Ahab was going to happen, Ben-Hadad comes down and he invades Israel again. And he sends his forces to the area of Aphek to fight Israel. Now, Aphek is located, it's actually southwest of Samaria, so he's gone even further south, again, to see, kind of get the land he wants, the plains or the valleys, I think as some of your translations will say. He's not trying to be fighting the hill country, because this whole thing they had about, they're the gods of this territory, not this. It doesn't make sense. In fact, it's going to be brought up here in a second. But this is what is going through his mind. He's going to choose his battlefield. So he's going actually past Samaria to get to this area, to get to some terrain that they think is beneficial to them for whatever reason. So he goes there, and in verse 27, it makes it pretty clear that the Israelite army that has gone out to fight the Aramean army is significantly smaller. 2 little herds of goats versus the entire countryside. The Israelite army is significantly smaller here. Then we have the man of God, presumably the same prophet from God as before, earlier in this chapter. I don't get any indication it's a different one. I think it's the same one. And he tells Ahab that God is once again going to give the army of the Arameans into his hands. And he gives 2 reasons here. One is to prove to the Arameans that God is God of all things, not just the hills. And also to prove to Ahab again that the Lord is God. Again, he's going to make this point again. Like I said, Ahab is going to get this lesson over and over and over again. He's never really going to get it. But it's not that God is not trying to convince him. Now, 7 days, there's no battle. We don't really get any details as to why there was a 7-day pause between the 2 forces fighting. They could have joined battle at any point. The Arameans should win in any of those cases. But for whatever reason, 7 days pass, and then the Israelites and the Arameans, they engage in battle, but Israel is victorious. Now, we don't get a lot of details about how they achieved this victory, even though we're told they were going to by the prophet of God. But we do see how many casualties there are. 100,000 Arameans, or 100,000 foot soldiers at least, were lost in a single day. It seems that the remaining Aramean army then flees to the city of Aphek. And when they do so, the wall of the city collapses on an additional 27,000 men. If we do the math here, which is not too difficult, Ben-Hadad has now lost 127,000 men of his army, and it describes him at the end of verse 30 as kind of being in hiding in this inner chamber in the city of Aphek. So again, we don't know exactly how big his army is, but he's lost 127,000 men in this moment, well, I guess 2 moments, in the battle and then the collapsing of the wall. And I want to give a little context of that from some other verses that we see in the Bible. If you go to Jonah chapter 4, verse 11, it describes the entire city of Nineveh population to be 120,000. So he's lost more than the entire population of Nineveh, that's bad. That's really bad. Or if you look at 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 35, when the angel of the Lord destroys the Syrian army. This is during the reign of Hezekiah, king of Judah. The Assyrians lose 185,000 men, and that empire was significantly larger and more powerful than this Aramean kingdom. So I get the idea that he's probably lost just about all of his army here. I can't imagine he's got much more in reserve. This is probably another reason why he's now hiding in this inner chamber. And Vic, this is a really bad position for him to be in, because where is he? He's not in Syria. He's not in his own country. He's not in Damascus. He's in Aphek, southwest of Samaria, deep in enemy territory. If he goes west, he's going to run into the ocean. If he goes east, he's got to go over the Jordan River and go through a lot of Israelite territory. If he goes north, he's got to go through a lot of Israelite territory to get back to where he came from. If he goes south, he's going through the kingdom of Judah. So he's in a bad spot here. He's not in any condition to, as he did last time, just get on his horse and ride away. He's kind of surrounded here. He's put himself in a corner and basically lost all of his army. Again, we don't know how big his army is, but it doesn't seem that they're in any position to really fight back at this point. So that's where we are at the end of verse 30. Any thoughts or comments about this second battle, which, again, we don't get a lot of details of, but a pretty high casualty rate, that's for sure. Okay, Jeff?
Further consider this disparity. The Israelites were not a professional army. A professional mechanic carries his own tools. A professional soldier has his own weapons that are customized to his style of fighting. I don't know about the Syrians per se, but it says that the Israelites were given their provisions. I doubt that means that they were given just food. I think they were given their weapons.
Yeah, it's not exactly clear. I don't know.
You know, they might come with a stick, but these are not professional soldiers. And they're like two little goat herds in a valley full of Syrians. And this, whether or not the first slaughter it was called a great slaughter, whether it matched this one or not, it is almost impossible for any nation to come back from this kind of loss. Even if it were a nation like Assyria, who was conquering other nations. When you think about this, Ben-Hadad feels like he can pick off this small, almost defenseless kingdom and start picking up. We've got 32 kings under him, and he's fixing to pick up some more. He's thinking of creating an empire from Syria. And Israel, these events are what keep that from happening.
Yeah.
In his lifetime.
Well, yeah, we're going to talk about his lifetime in a little and how we'll get to the end of it too eventually. So I'm not going to spoil anything too much, but yeah, some great points here. On paper, there's no reason Israel should ever win this battle. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Bethany?
I have a question. You might have mentioned this and I missed it, but is the man of God that's talking here, is that Elisha or Elijah?
My understanding is that it's not. It's probably the same one that shows up earlier in the chapter, but they're not named. And we'll actually see several times where a prophet of God or a prophet in the company of prophets is called on by God to do something, but it never seems to be implied that it's ever Elijah or Elisha. In fact, Elijah will kind of come back by name. We'll know for sure it's him. And his interactions with Ahab are very different than with these guys. Ahab will recognize one of them. We'll read about it in a little bit. But it's never revealed to be Elijah. There doesn't seem to be any reason to think it's Elijah. I have more reason to think it's not than I do that it might be. We're not told for sure, but I would think that it would say it's Elijah if it was, on top of all that. But did you have a hand up? Or okay. All right. All right, let's continue on here. We'll try to finish out this chapter if we can this week. So I'm going to read for us chapter 20, verses 31 through 34, please.
Servant Ben-Hadad says, "Please let me live." said, "Is he still alive? He is my brother." Now, when the men were watching closely to see whether any sign of mercy would come from him, and they quickly grasped at the word, he said, "Your brother, Ben-Hadad." So he said, "Go, bring him." Then Ben-Hadad came out to him, and he had come up into the chariot. So Ben-Hadad said to him, "The cities which my father took from your father I will restore, and you may set up marketplaces for yourselves in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria." Then Ahab said, "I will send you away with this treaty." So he made a treaty with him and sent him away.
Okay. So to kind of further add to the idea that Ben-Hadad has pretty much lost probably all of his army, they're not even thinking about fighting at this point. They're saying, let's see if we can just seek some mercy here. We'll just ask for him to let us go. It is interesting here. Again, I don't know where these Aramean officials are getting their ideas about Israelites, but they say something to the effect that Israelite kings have this this notion for being merciful to people, which I don't know. I go through the kings of Israel before this. I'm like, I don't see that anywhere. I'm not sure where this is coming from. But this is what they've come up with. And so they basically ask for parley and, basically, let us live. Please show us mercy. They put themselves in sackcloth and ropes, which are extremely uncomfortable as a sign of great humility. They're kind of basically pleading. They're on their knees to Ahab. And I'm sure this, was really stroked Ahab's ego quite a bit because of what he does here. In fact, it's interesting when we get to the officials asking for Ben-Hadad to live. Ahab almost seems surprised, perhaps, that he's still alive. I mean, there's been this battle. There's been this wall collapse where 27,000 people died. So maybe he wasn't sure if Ben-Hadad was still alive or not. Not a lot of detail on that, but it is interesting that he asked that question. And he calls him his brother, and this is what the officials kind of pick up on, and they again reiterate, yes, your brother, he's alive. There's no clear ties between Ahab and Ben-Hadad directly that I know of. I was thinking, perhaps, maybe through his wife Jezebel, but she is Phoenician from Sidon, which is not the same country, so I didn't really see any tie there. But I think it might be interesting to see if they're drawing upon the connection that Israel and Aram do have, which we kind of talked about in our Abraham study a little bit. It's funny we keep going back to that. If you remember, Abraham had two brothers. One died early, Haran, and then the other one, Nahor. Nahor eventually settles, it seems, in the area of what would be Aram, and his grandson, Aram, the son of Kemuel, which was one of his middle kids, I think. He has a son named Aram. So he's a descendant of Nahor. And then also, when we read later on in, I think it's Genesis, let's see, I have it in my notes here. Genesis 25, verse 20, describes Nahor's son Bethuel and his grandson Laban. They're described as Arameans in that verse specifically. So there is sort of this cousinly sort of tie. I mean, it's very distant at this point. We're many generations away from Abraham and Nahor, but there is a slight connection here. I don't know if that's what Ahab is referencing, or if it's sort of like a brother of kings. Every king sort of understands each other a little bit because no one else is quite like them, or if he's drawing upon the neighborly ties since they are neighboring nations. I'm not sure. This is probably the closest thing that I could find. But for whatever reason, this is the connection that they land on. And Ahab invites Ben-Hadad to join him in his chariot, and Ben-Hadad basically offers, I'm not going to call it a bribe, but terms of surrender, I guess is maybe the better way of looking at it. And of course, these in themselves are a little bit interesting. I tried to look at them a little bit in my research. He talks about how he's going to return some territory. He says, I will return the cities my father took from your father. Now, I looked into this, and there's no record in the Bible, at least, of any details of King Omri losing territory to a king of Aram in any battle or anything like that. There is an instance in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 20, and it's also recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 4, during the reign of King Asa of Judah, when Ben-Hadad takes Israelite territory of Ijon, Dan, Abel Beth, or Abel Maam, depending on where you're looking, Kiriath, and Naphtali. But this is during the reign of Baasha, king of Israel, which not only is not Ahab's father, but is not actually a relation at all, because there are all those coups, you remember, and a bunch of people got killed off, and their family lines got killed off. So he's not even the same family line. So I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to there. There may be another instance where King Omri did have battle with the Arameans, and the Arameans took some territory. That's entirely possible. It may just not be recorded for us. Or maybe this is what he's referring to, is this territory that Baasha lost during the reign of Asa of Judah. But I believe that was also Ben-Hadad, who was king at the time of Aram. So I'm not exactly sure on that, but I thought I'd just bring it up. The other thing that he mentions is that he would allow Ahab to set up an Israelite market in the area of Damascus, which would give Israel a major economic boost. You'd have direct access to the goods of Damascus, which was a very major city in ancient times and even to today. And this also might include some tax exemptions, some perks here and there of the economic goods. Again, we're not told of any details of the Aramean markets being set up in Samaria by Ben-Hadad's father. Again, this may be something that just was not recorded, but I'm not exactly sure. It's not mentioned. It's just kind of mentioned here, kind of as an aside. But in any case, Ahab seems happy with these terms, and so they sign a treaty, and he lets Ben-Hadad go. So Ben-Hadad returns to his territory. He is not killed. Ahab spares him, but Ahab gets a little bit of territory and some economic incentives in return. So those are the terms. Any comments on that before we move on to the final part of this chapter, which I intend to finish? Okay. All right, well then if there's no other questions or comments, let's move on. Someone read for us verses 35 through 43. That's through the end of the chapter. 35 through 43.
Now a certain man of the sons of the prophets said to his neighbor, by the word of the Lord, strike me, please. And the man refused to strike him. Then he said to him, because you have not obeyed the voice of the Lord, surely as soon as you depart from me, a lion shall kill you. And as soon as he left him, a lion found him and killed him. And he found another man and said, strike me, please. So the man struck him, inflicting a wound. Then the prophet departed and waited for the king by the road, and disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes. Now as the king passed by, he cried out to the king and said, your servant went out into the midst of the battle, and there a man came over and brought a man to me, and said, guard this man, by any means he is missing, your life shall be for his life, or else you shall pay a talent of silver. And while your servant was busy here and there, he was gone. And the king of Israel said to him, so shall your judgment be, you yourself have decided it. Then he hastened to take the bandage away from his eyes. And the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. And he said to him, thus says the Lord, because you have let slip out of your hand a man whom I appointed to utter destruction, therefore your life shall go for his life, and your people for his people. So the king of Israel went to his house, sullen and displeased, and came to Samaria.
Okay. So we have, and your translations will vary a little bit about who this person is that the Lord comes to, or the word of the Lord comes to. Some translations will say son of the prophets. Some may say group of prophets, or one of the company of prophets. Basically, there are other prophets up and about in Israel. I don't have any issue with the wording of it. It's just, we don't know exactly who this is. It's this guy who has something to do with the prophets that are working in Israel. Seems that he's a prophet himself, working with some others, and he's got other people with him. Again, but we're not told a name. Again, I don't think it's Elijah. Now, it's unclear whether this is the same one from earlier in the chapter or a different one. Ahab does recognize this prophet. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the same one from before. Just the way, it talks about this word of the Lord coming to this prophet, it seems almost to imply it's a different prophet. Otherwise, I feel like it would be worded a little differently, saying that something to the effect to lead us to know that it's the same one from before, but it doesn't. I don't really know for sure, but in my mind, I think it's a different prophet. But anyway, he receives word from the Lord, and he says to his companion, "Strike me with your weapon," which is an odd request, to say the least. And his companion refuses, and so he tells him that because you've not obeyed the Lord, you will basically be killed by a lion as soon as you leave me, which does happen. This guy dies by the, I was going to say hand of a lion, but I guess the paw or claw or teeth. We don't know. We don't get a lot of detail on it, but he does get killed by a lion. And so this prophet goes and he finds another man, and he says to him, strike me with your weapon. And this one does so. And I don't know why this one decided that this was a good idea or why the other one refused. It's not clear what the difference between them was, but he does strike the prophet and wounds him, which is apparently what he wanted. So this prophet goes out and he stands by a road, waiting for King Ahab to come by. So he's ready for him, and he disguises himself with his headband. It talks about this headband he's got. He puts it over his eyes, so Ahab's not going to recognize him right away. But he's basically positioned himself there, waiting for Ahab to come by. Now, lo and behold, here comes King Ahab. I'm sure the Lord kind of guided this prophet to go where he needed to be, because King Ahab does come by, and the prophet tells him a story here, and it's a very interesting story. Basically, he was talking about a captive that he was put in charge of, and if the captive went missing, there would be a price to pay, and one of those terms would be, if he's missing, it's your life or his life kind of thing. And there's also this thing where you pay a talent of silver. But I think the first part is what we're focusing on here, because this is what's going to come up later. And he then kind of divulges to Ahab, like, I was doing some work here and there, and then when I came back, my captive was gone. And Ahab basically says, well, sounds like you're not going to have a good time because you've said so yourself what was going to happen, and you've basically admitted that you messed up, and that's going to be your punishment, I guess, your life for his. And then we have this kind of twist reveal where the prophet reveals himself and takes the headband off from over his eyes, and Ahab recognizes him, as we've mentioned before, and basically tells him what he has done, what he's messed up on. The prophet declares, and this is again from the Lord, to Ahab that God had sent Ahab to do a mission. He had intended for Ahab to not let Ben-Hadad go, I think is the implication here. God had a prisoner in Ahab's hands, and Ahab let this prisoner go. He was one who was marked for death, and Ahab did not do that work. Now, there's a whole lot that I think we can compare this to. First thing I want to note, though, is God already has a person picked out to replace Ben-Hadad. If you remember back to our when we were studying the previous chapter 19, one of the tasks Elijah was given was to go and anoint Hazael king over Aram. Now, we're not given that instance happening in any detail, although Elisha has a meeting with him later on and kind of confirms that to be the case. But God has already picked someone else to replace him. Now, this is a very interesting thing. There's a lot of things I probably want to bring up, but we may not get to all of them. I may just mention them quickly. This whole situation with the prophet coming to the king and kind of revealing his sin to him reminds me a lot of Nathan the prophet when he talks to David, and he talks about the rich man with all these sheep and the poor man with the one, and he talks about how the rich man took the poor one sheep and killed it and offered it and all these things. And David said, David was livid. He was angry. And he says, that rich man, that man should die. And Nathan, the great, I think it's King James, thou art the man, And David immediately recognizes what he's done. And the difference here between Ahab and David is David repents. I mean, he's definitely messed up. He's done some terrible things, but he doesn't say, well, it doesn't matter. You know, I'm king. What does it matter? Ahab never seems to turn the corner. He's just angry about it. David tries to do right, and he tries to repent for all these things, and he admits to his guilt. Ahab's just mad. I think another interesting thing to compare it to is when Saul was called to go kill all the Amalekites. He does not do that. He spares the king as one of those things he spares. That is one of the reasons that the Lord takes away the kingdom of Israel from him and his lineage, as prophesied by Samuel the prophet. Let's see, any other comparisons I want to make? I mean, those are pretty strong ones. This is not the first time God does something like this or punishes someone for not carrying through a similar act. And so I think it's really interesting that God has decided to use this again. And certainly I would imagine that Ahab has heard this story before, either of Saul or of David, whatever comparison we want to make. And he probably recognizes that he's messed up. Now, we get no indication that Ahab is saying, oh, you know, I've sinned, you know, let me repent. What can I do to make this right? He just leaves. He's angry, but he seems to understand that he has done wrong. He's not, you know, trying to have this prophet killed for saying these things, because he kind of knows who's in charge. Because what's happened? He's had the whole incidents with the drought, the fire on Mount Carmel, the killing of the 450 prophets of Baal. These two great battles that he should not have won, that the Lord gave him into his hand. So Ahab understands he can't do anything about this. He can't fight God on this, but he seems to be kind of unwilling to repent of this anyway. But he doesn't argue. He goes home angry, which is so much like Ahab, as we'll see in the next chapter. Any further comments or anything on this section or this chapter in general before we close out chapter 20 finally? We've been here for a while. Go ahead, Jeff.
There are many reasons why worldly people don't understand God. Part of it is because they feel like partial obedience is enough. If I do more good than bad, then I'm okay. And Ahab felt like he had done a lot. You know, he throttled Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad would not be any more trouble outside his borders probably for the rest of his life. But apparently, like you said, he should have understood God's intentions for him. He was an agent, an instrument in God's hand to do God's will. And it was God's will that Ben-Hadad be destroyed. So he didn't do that. So he goes home angry, and I just know he's saying, how can I ever please this God? He's inexplicable. He can't be understood. We have to seek to understand God. We have to change the way we think to learn how to think as much as we can like God thinks. And just a casual effort is never going to be enough. You can't just, I gave a whole hour of my life to this effort. No, you need to give your whole attention and focus completely. It's like worship. People come to worship and their mind's on everything else but worship. They're thinking about things of this life and the ball game and what's going on with politics and different things like that. And we have to recognize that when we come to God in any capacity, whether it's at worship or when we individually obey during the week or whatever in our lives, we have to give him undivided attention. He deserves that. And just a casual effort toward God is never going to suffice, and we'll never understand why that is, because a casual effort might be okay for us, but God is not like that.
And that was kind of the problem with Saul also is, you know, with the whole thing with the Amalekites, he was told to slaughter all the people and all the livestock, but the livestock were spared because, you know, we could offer this to God or as a sacrifice. But Samuel says that wasn't the instruction. You didn't follow all the directions as you were told. You partially followed them. And yeah, we do have a tendency to do that. And Paul writes in Romans, I think it's chapter 10, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. Or is that chapter 12? 12, there we go. And so, you know, it's not just, you know, give a little bit. It's, you kind of have to give the whole thing. It's not a one-time thing.
Why was David different? Because he was a man after God's own heart.
And he continually sought God, even when, like in the instance with Bathsheba, he had done wrong. He went to seek God's repentance. He didn't flee or say, it doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. He didn't shirk it off or anything. He admitted to his wrong, and he sought God again after that. Though he did receive some punishment from him. David recognized that God was doing the right thing, and he was going to submit to it.
I want to talk too about the difference between Ben-Hadad and David when he came back from his sin. Ben-Hadad here is absolutely and utterly humiliated. There is no greater humility than what he suffered here. I'm not talking about on the battlefield. He dresses himself in sackcloth, puts ropes around his head. These are all signs of submission. The rope is something that would be used maybe in a slave line or something when you're traveling place to place to keep the slaves from going. It's not around his head, it's around his neck probably. And so it's a symbol that I am your servant. And he comes out in sackcloth. It's a symbol that he repents for ever having gone up against Ahab. This is absolute and complete humiliation. David was humiliated, but he freely humbled himself before God. There were some people who knew about what David did. Some people in the palace, I'm sure, and things like that. But there were a lot of people in the nation that they would not have known a lot of those details. And now David brings it out and admits to it. One humility is constructive. The other is just a consequence of stubbornness and sin. And a lot of times people go to jail and they feel sorry for themselves and they act like the victim. But if you went to jail and received the just penalty for your crimes, whatever that is, you should not feel like the victim in this. You've paid your price. You're free from your penalty and you paid for your crimes. You should be respected as any other person, but you don't wear it like a badge of honor that you have been, put upon by having to go to prison. And so when we're tempted, when we suffer for the thing, for doing wrong, 1 Peter 2 says, and we take it patiently, that's not special. That's what we should do. But when we suffer for doing good and take it patiently, then we're especially, I guess you say special, then we're special to God, because that's what Jesus did.
Yeah, and in David's situation, he's not deep in enemy territory, stuck in a corner with no other way out. Ben-Hadad didn't have any other options.
Well, so what
Yeah.
you say is the humility was forced upon Ben-Hadad.
Yeah.
But
David took it willingly.
David, and
Yeah.
that's why that type of humility and that type of repentance is precious to God, because God knows how hard that is.
Yeah. Well, one other detail I do want to kind of touch upon before we close out. We're about out of time, so we won't start chapter 21. But here when the Lord talks about, here in verse 42, at the end he says, therefore it is, I'll just read the first 42. He said to the king, this is what the Lord says, you have set free a man I determined should die. Therefore it is your life for his life, your people for his people. Now, I want to talk about just comparing Ahab and Ben-Hadad here for just a moment. Ahab's life is going to end rather soon here. He's going to die in chapter 22. Spoilers. Ahab he's going to be on his way out here very soon. Ben-Hadad, he's going to go on living for quite a while. He will not die until 2 Kings chapter 8. And he dies by the hand of Hazael, the person who God had chosen to replace him anyway. So Ben-Hadad is not going to live forever, but he's going to outlive Ahab here. Ahab really has kind of relinquished his life in this situation, which, I'm not sure how long Ahab would have gone otherwise if he had done correctly in this moment. He was still a bad king. We get every indication of and every description of that. But perhaps he would have maybe been a little bit better off. We're not exactly sure. It's one of those what ifs that we don't really have an answer for. But it is an interesting thing to see that Ahab was supposed to kill this king. He was supposed to kill Ben-Hadad. Lets him go. Ahab is going to die very soon after this. We're going to have chapter 21 with Naboth's vineyard. That's a pretty famous story. But the chapter after that, he's going to die. And in not a very good way. It's going to be pretty violent, as they tend to be in Israel. But Ben-Hadad will eventually be dethroned by force. He will be killed by Hazael. So God's will still happen. God's intentions will still happen, but it won't be by the hand of Ahab, because Ahab will be long gone by that point. So just kind of an interesting note to think of here. So when, this prophet is saying these things, that this is really going to come to pass. We're going to stop there. Like I said, we'll pick up in chapter 21 next week. I don't really know if we'll get through it all. We'll at least start it next week. So go ahead, if you haven't already, read through chapter 21, and you can be ready for our study for next week. Thank you.